address, 9125 12th Street. And then you'll see some wording above the address. And the wording above the address is the real name of that place. It's the United Community League for Civic Action. So now, what we're talking about is a raid of a political organization. A place that was organized by Bill Scott II in order to have people register to vote who lived in that community. And of course, when you're registering people to vote, and when you're organizing a political organization, one thing that goes with all political organizations is fundraising. And what we call the Blind Pig actually originated out of the fundraising arm of the United Community League for Civic Action. But if I told you that a political organization was being raided, it would be less weird for you that people were upset and organized to resist the police. But generally that's never talked about. And that place was just as much that as it was the illegal after hours bar. So of course on July 23rd, after that raid, of course there was resistance by a crowd who had gathered outside of the place at 3:30 in the morning. It's hot outside, probably about what we're feeling right now, except the difference is there was no refuge. So going in your home would be 100 degrees probably, because nobody had air conditioners and ceiling fans and all the different things we have today. They didn't have that in 1967, and particularly in that neighborhood they didn't. And so you would be outside to get some level of relief. This is cooler than in your house. And so people are outside to get some relief, and they see this crowd of officers trying to at least bring out 82 to 85 people from the club. And of course, it's taken a very long time. And so as they're bringing people out of the club, the crowd is getting bigger and bigger. They're getting more hostile, and they're hostile over all kinds of issues. Some of those issues, they may not have even consciously understood why they were upset. But they were upset over the long history of housing discrimination. Detroit has a long history of housing discrimination, starting out as individual housing discrimination. Just people saying, I don't want to rent or sell to these people. Of course, African Americans were always on that list of these people. Other groups were also sometimes on that list. Jewish people were sometimes on that list. Sometimes Irish people were on that list. But African Americans were always on the list of people who were part of these racially restrictive covenants. And these were agreements by the home seller to the home buyer that when you leave this home, you would not rent, sell, or lease to an African American. And so Detroit was sectioned off by originally individuals doing this, then finally, or moving after that, neighborhood associations creating whole neighborhoods that would be segregated. Instead of just this house on a block segregated, the whole neighborhood would be segregated. And then finally, the federal government would get involved in the Federal Housing Act of 1934 and institutionalize a policy of racial segregation and housing discrimination in federal policy. And they will buttress it in the Federal Housing Act of 1949. So it starts in 1934 and then strengthened in 1949. This is what Detroit is suffering from, at least African Americans are suffering from in the city of Detroit. There are whole neighborhoods in Detroit where African Americans cannot be in. So of course you may have heard the term sundown towns, where black people had to be out of town by sundown. When I was growing up, Dearborn was still a sundown town. And I was told by my grandparents, don't go in Dearborn and definitely don't be there after dark. But before you had sundown towns, you had sundown neighborhoods in the same city. So Detroit had certain neighborhoods that African Americans could not be in after sundown. And this was the case from the early 1900s all the way into the 1960s. So you had this issue, long-standing issue. And of course, going along with that issue is school inequality. As you know, you have housing segregation. One of the foundations that housing segregation creates is school segregation. And school segregation creates school inequality. Today, we talk about the problems of school inequality, particularly Detroit public schools versus some of the suburban schools. So Detroit versus Grosse Pointe. Of course, we'll see inequality in those two public school systems. But before, you didn't have this issue. We weren't even talking about Detroit school system versus the suburbs. We were talking about Detroit public schools in predominantly black communities versus Detroit public schools in predominantly white communities in the same city and under the same school system. So as the school became predominantly white, more resources were poured into that school, and as schools became predominantly black, resources were taken out of the schools in the same district. So we're not talking about two different entities, two different political entities. We're talking about the same school district, and monies and resources being diverted from one to the other. And this is what African Americans have been dealing with for decades. Along with that, of course, the major issue that African Americans have been dealing with for decades, which really more than any one issue prompts this uprising in 1967, is police brutality. So, of course, police brutality had been a long-standing practice in the city of Detroit. In 1925, the same year that a local resident, Dr. Ashian Sweet, not that far from where we are right now, on Garland and Charlevoix, 2905 Garland, refused to budge, refused to move, even though there was a white mob telling him that he had no right to live in his neighborhood. He refused to do that, and of course, in the course of refusing, he defends his home and shoots 2 people in that mob. That same year, 1925, everybody in the home is arrested. Eventually, they will be acquitted with the help of Clarence Darrow, the NAACP legal defense team that is hired to defend Dr. Ashian Sweet. But that same year, 55 African Americans are shot in the city of Detroit by Detroit police officers. You could have had a Black Lives Matter movement in the city of Detroit, just the city of Detroit, in the year 1925. 55 African Americans were shot. They didn't all get killed, but 55 African Americans were shot in just that one year. That was Detroit in the 1920s. And this problem of police brutality continued through the 1920s, through the 1930s, through the 1940s. Of course, the 1943 race riot occurs. And the 1943 race riot starts right here on Belle Isle. In that race riot, 34 people are killed. 25 African Americans and 9 whites. Out of the 25 African Americans who are killed, 17 of them are killed by the Detroit Police Department. No whites are killed by the Detroit Police Department. So you have that, you have the 1950s, and of course you have the 1960s. And you can't go past the killing of Cynthia Scott in 1963 on John R. near Mack, when the police shoot this woman and they claim it's in self-defense. And of course this black woman has been shot 2 times in the back and once in the stomach. The police do their own internal investigation and find the officers didn't do anything wrong. They're not even suspended for a day. And this is the environment that we're living in 1967. And then, of course, African Americans have been uprooted from their home communities, Black Bottom and Paradise Valley. So the Lower East Side, where African Americans have a residential district, and then they have their business district called Paradise Valley. All together in the 1920s and 30s, African Americans are running 350 black-owned businesses in both of those communities. And of course, this is destroyed by a combination of federal, state, and local policy. So we already have individuals who are racially discriminatory, but now we have federal, state, and local policy joining in with this. And this destroys these 2 important African American communities. African Americans have to move somewhere else, and many of them find refuge or homes or really rental spots in the 12th Street, Dexter, and Linwood neighborhoods. The reason why so many African Americans are there is because of the destruction of Paradise Valley and Black Bottom. And many people who are there remember living in Paradise Valley or Black Bottom. Remember having businesses in Paradise Valley, and remember having homes in Black Bottom. And even that's on their minds on July of 1967. And if it's not on their minds, it's on their children's mind who they've told about this story. And so this is where we are on July 23rd, 1967. There's a lot going on. Just talking about those 5 days is not enough. You have to talk about at least the 5 decades that preceded. And so that's where we are. And so on July 23rd, 1967, that's the beginning of this rebellion. It would last 5 days. And in those 5 days, 43 people officially, the official number of people who were killed was 43. Thousands of people, of course, are arrested. Over 7,000 people are arrested. Over 1,000 people, of course, are seriously injured. All kinds of property damage and destruction. You would have thought the whole city was burning down if you were living back then, because you saw all this smoke and you saw tanks coming down the street and you heard sirens everywhere and you heard shooting. Now, of course, we're 50 years later and we realize that it really was not much. A small area of Detroit was really had faced the strongest amount of destruction. But it affected the whole city, although only one really significant area of the city of Detroit, 12th Street, Linwood, Dexter neighborhood, and some areas on off Mac also, were really hit the hardest. And it wasn't any burnings on 7 Mile in Wyoming. You know, North Rosedale Park didn't burn down. But people thought the whole city was going to burn down or was burning down. You even had most of the suburbs had curfews because they thought that the city was going to get burned down and people were going to come out of the city and burn down their cities. So Grosse Pointe went into a curfew. Livonia went into a curfew. Grand Rapids went into a curfew. Wow. On the other side of the state, Flint went into a curfew. So people just thought the whole state was going to go down because of this tight, really, area in the city of Detroit. But during that time period, the police, by the end of the first day, had filled up the 10th precinct. All of the holding cells in the 10th precinct were full, and they had people housed in the garage on the ground at the 10th precinct, in the parking garage. Then, of course, they filled up the main headquarters downtown. They filled that up. And after that was filled up, they used the buses. So people were detained on Detroit DDOT buses. No bathrooms, of course, on those buses. So for those 2 or 3 days that people were being held, you can imagine what they had, what it was like to be held on a public transportation bus and no restroom. All right? Many of these people were never charged with anything. So their family didn't even know that they were being held. So some of their families thought they had been killed. They had gotten killed during the rebellion, and it would be days later when they get released and sent back home that their families would be elated that they see them. And then, of course, Belle Isle was used also as a detention center. The two, first the women's changing rooms, the women's bathhouse was used first. After it was filled, the men's bathhouse. Unlike the buses, the bathhouse at least had restrooms. So at least people could use the restroom. But the bathhouses were used as well, and people were held, again, these are mostly African Americans, almost all African Americans are being held there in these bathhouses, in this group kind of detention center, and they're being held where their families don't know where they are. They don't get no one phone call. There's been, in some cases, no police report done, and so nobody even knows that they're there. And when they get released the next week, so it's the following week, the rebellion is over, and it's the following week when some of them go home. Their parents, their family are totally surprised and shocked to see them living, because they had been held here incognito, when no one knew where they were. So today, we have to revisit all of these things. You can't really bring peace to this without at least acknowledging what happened during this time period. And of course, we gotta acknowledge the killings of many innocent people, including 4-year-old Tanya Blanding on July 25th, the morning of July 25th, and of course 3 teenagers who were killed in the evening of July 25th, almost as it goes over into July 26th at the Algiers Motel on Woodward in Virginia Park. And so as we acknowledge all of those things and try to bring peace on this International Day of Peace, we have to just really feel what Belle Isle means to us now. Because when I was growing up, this was a beautiful place. It was a park I came to all the time, and I didn't know anything about that 67 history that occurred here. But now that I know that, I can acknowledge that and then try to move forward and view this park in a different way. And so that's what I'm trying to do, and that's what I hope everybody's trying to do, that we acknowledge this history, deal with this history, and then move to a better place. And then as we're doing that, talk about what happened here in 1943 when the race riot occurred in June of 1943. And as we're talking about that, talk about the fact that this place was used as a site during the Underground Railroad period. So African Americans who were escaping to freedom on their way to Canada used this as a place to hide away from slave catchers on their way to Canada. That's important too. We need to understand that history, which is less talked about when we talk about Belle Isle. And we have to talk about the fact that this was Ottawa land. This was the Odawa land before McDougall somehow ended up with it. And after McDougall somehow ended up with it, he sells it to Macomb. And of course, William Macomb, we have to acknowledge that William Macomb is the largest slave owner in Detroit's history. Detroit had slavery. And William McComb is the largest slave owner. And his brother is the third largest slave owner in New York's history. And we know there's a whole county named after his brother. And so we have to acknowledge that history. We have to acknowledge the fact that the McCombs sell it to the Campars. And Joseph Campar is also one of the prominent slave owners in the city of Detroit, along with his nephew, John R. Williams, and his wife, Adelaide DeQuinder. They're all slave owners in the city of Detroit. We have to acknowledge all of that history. So when we bring all of that history together, then we can move towards peace. But we can't talk about peace and don't even acknowledge this history. Thank you all for listening as long as you have.